Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the deep and, honestly, often paradoxical world of humanitarian aid. You know, when most of us think of disaster relief, we immediately picture moving massive boxes, flying in pallets of supplies, and executing these super rigid logistical plans. But as we'll see through the on-the-ground experiences of Mikkel Lang-Jensen Forsby, true humanitarian work, it isn't just about spreadsheets and supply chains. It's actually about navigating seemingly impossible human dilemmas in some of the most fragile environments on Earth.
Okay, let's dive into this. I want you to imagine, for a second, that you are a humanitarian worker in a refugee reception camp. Suddenly, a food shortage hits. More people have arrived than there is food to go around, and new supplies? Well, they aren't going to show up for days. What do? Do you give absolutely everyone smaller portions? Do you maybe give healthy adults less so that kids and the sick can get a standard ration? How do you protect the most vulnerable without accidentally making them targets? This extreme scenario perfectly frames the incredible stakes of humanitarian logic. Literally every single option has a consequence, and the quote-unquote right choice is rarely simple.
Forsby actually came into this world from a background in corporate logistics. Now, that's a world completely defined by structure, predictability, highly organized warehouses, and measurable key performance indicators, or KPIs. But when he actually stepped into the field, that rigid corporate mindset just violently collided with humanitarian reality. Out there, you can't just rely on a standardized rulebook. You have to rely on relationships, on trust, and on human dignity, often while operating in absolute unmitigated chaos. He very quickly realized that a completely new paradigm was needed.
To really understand this shift, let's follow Forsby to Cambodia back in 2013. He left behind those predictable corporate supply chains to ride along the dusty roads of Phnom Penh and the rural Prey Vang province. He really wanted to get a handle on how local non-governmental organizations actually operated on the ground. And it was here that he met Soka, a local NGO worker whose logic and entire worldview just completely shattered Western corporate ideals of how aid should be distributed. The massive cultural disconnect between international donors and local workers is just beautifully captured by Soka himself. When he was asked point blank if he helps his family and if he thought that constituted nepotism, he was brutally honest. He simply said, "I don't help my family because I work here. I work here because I want to help my family." To Western donors, this kind of local commitment is almost always flagged as bias or even corruption. But for Soka and other local workers, this deep personal commitment to their own community is the absolute core of genuine humanitarian motivation.
Soka explained that he views his relationship with international donors as, well, basically a business transaction. It's a simple exchange of reports for money. But his relationship with the villages, that is a true partnership built on mutual insight and a shared lived reality. For local workers who are actively navigating droughts and poverty right alongside their neighbors, relationships aren't some bias to be eliminated. They are the very foundation of survival. You help the people you know, the people you trust, and the people whose struggles you intimately understand. So out of these raw, local experiences, Forsby distilled a really powerful framework. He calls them the 5 cornerstones of humanitarian logic: relational continuity, relational integrity, foresight, fairness, and equity, and communication as responsibility. Now, keep in mind, this isn't some list of rigid corporate rules for people to just blindly follow. Instead, they represent a hard-won mindset for navigating responsibility in incredibly complex, messy environments. Let's break down exactly what each of these means in practice.
The first cornerstone is relational continuity. Think about the aid world. International donors and specific projects come and go all the time, completely depending on funding cycles. But the local workers and the villagers, they stay. Soka knows that if he isn't there for the community over the long haul, his existence as an aid worker is totally unjustified. Trust isn't just some resource you tap into for a quick 6-month project. It's a structure you literally have to build and maintain over a lifetime. Second up is relational integrity. Look, having good intentions just isn't enough. You have to take actual responsibility for the consequences of your actions. While donors sitting in faraway offices are demanding spreadsheet data and KPI figures, the villages are demanding truth. If Soka promises something to a village, he absolutely must deliver. Keeping promises is non-negotiable because the people he serves are the ones who have to live with the fallout of empty words. The third cornerstone is foresight. This means you have to anticipate tensions before they explode. Think about it like this. If an NGO comes in and builds a desperately needed well for one village, they can't just pack up, walk away, and celebrate a job well done. They have to anticipate the jealousy, the questions, and the potential conflict that exact same well might create in the neighboring village that got absolutely nothing.
Foresight is all about seeing 2 steps ahead of your own good deeds.
Fourth, we have fairness and equity. Interestingly enough, Soka outright rejects the Western ideals of strict detached neutrality. I mean, how can he be neutral when his own family and friends live right there in the village? He can't. Instead, he strives for fairness. Fairness means acting consistently and adjusting your support to the very real, specific needs of the community, rather than trying to force everyone into equal, arbitrary categories just because a donor's grant proposal says so.
And the 5th cornerstone is communication as responsibility. Words shape reality. While international donors often love to hear big buzzwords and grand sweeping promises, effective local communication relies on small words. It relies on strict realism. Soka rule is super simple. Only say what you can actually vouch for. If you say you're going to help, you help. If you can't, you admit you can't. All right, let's shift gears and see what happens when we move from the deliberate, relational pace of rural Cambodia to just absolute, utter chaos. In April 2015, a massive 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck Nepal. The very next day, a huge 6.7 magnitude aftershock hit, followed by over 400 more aftershocks in the coming weeks. Farsby was actually deployed there as a logistics delegate. Here, those 5 cornerstones were put to the ultimate stress test right in the middle of a frantic international crisis response.
The international community immediately pushed for the mass distribution of standardized non-food relief item kits. We're talking tarps, blankets, tools, that sort of thing. But this highly standardized corporate-style logistics approach just hit a massive wall. The reality on the ground was defined by entirely unpredictable landslides, totally shattered infrastructure, and strict curfews. You can have the most perfect distribution plan sitting on a spreadsheet, but it means absolutely nothing if the mountain road you need to take has literally collapsed.
For example, Farsby meticulously planned out a route to the Gorkha district using a fleet of 4-wheel drive trucks. But the roads were so incredibly dangerous that the local drivers just outright refused to proceed. They feared for their lives, and rightly so. In that moment, the rigid logistical plan had to be completely thrown out. Applying relational integrity and foresight meant recognizing that the safety of those drivers completely overrode the donor targets. So they rapidly relocated the distribution points to ensure everyone's physical safety.
This whole chaotic experience in Nepal proved that true humanitarian logic really isn't about blind efficiency. As Falsbergsy realized, and I love this quote, "We have a responsibility to those we help, not only for what we give them, but also for how we do it. Adjusting rigid plans to actually honor the human dignity and physical safety of everyone involved, from the people receiving the aid all the way to the local truck drivers delivering it, is what actually saves lives in the long run."
Taking a step back, Farsby leaves us with a really profound realization based on his time in both Cambodia and Nepal. Development without local influence might create a flurry of temporary activity, sure, but it almost always fades the second that international funding ends. However, development with local roots, fostering that slow, sustainable progress driven by existing community trust, that is what creates lasting change. International aid has to be a catalyst for local capacity, not some parallel structure that just ignores the people who actually live there. Looking back at Cambodia, Soka noted something fascinating about this dynamic. He said, "A grant is not a gift. That is a possibility, and opportunities are rare here. Real humanitarian impact doesn't come from forcing a Western logistics model onto a rural village. It comes from giving people the dignity of choice. It comes from small grants given transparently that empower a family to buy chickens or seeds and actually build their own sustainable future on their own terms." Ultimately, Farsby's experiences show us that these dilemmas aren't just reserved for disaster zones halfway across the world. We all face competing needs and limited resources in our own lives. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to chew on. Think about those 5 cornerstones. How do you build relational continuity, exercise foresight, and communicate with real, genuine responsibility in your own life and in your own community? The logic of human connection is universal. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep exploring.